Hey, what's up? This is Scott with Level Up Tutorials, and in this video, we're going to be introducing GraphCool, what it means for us in this overall stack of things we're working with, and we're going to be talking about GraphQL overall and how we're going to be using it over the course of this app. So let's get going on that right now. Okay, so in the last video, we talked quite a bit about getting set up with our navigation. And now that we have our navigation set up, well, it's time to start thinking about our API, which is going to be one of the cooler, most interesting aspects of this entire series. Because in addition to having a fully functional app, we want to save and add data into it. And one of the greatest ways to do that is using GraphQL. Now, one of the cool things about GraphQL is that there's a new service called graph.cool. Now, GraphCool is basically your entire backend. You can think of it as a system like Contentful or one of these CMS as a service types of sites where you don't have to worry about managing a database and you don't have to worry about really anything but connecting to their endpoint. And in my opinion, this framework, or graph.cool, is just extremely exciting. Now, if you're concerned about hosting your stuff on other people's servers, or you want more control, well, luckily for you, there's this introducing Prisma, which really just came out a couple of days ago, January 16th as it is. So as I'm recording this, yeah, it definitely just came out. But what is Prisma? It's the open source GraphQL API layer for your database, aka you can use Prisma to basically use an open sourced version of GraphCool. So if you're one of those people who likes to use all open source stuff, there's Prisma here for you. Since that's not going to be the focus of this course, I want to actually go ahead and use the hosted version of GraphCool, which, let me tell you, is excellent. So to do so, we're going to click Open Console, and from here, it's going to ask you to log in. I'm just going to log in with my GitHub profile. You can certainly create a new email or any of that stuff if you'd like. And from here, it's going to take you to your console. Now, I have an example project here already, but what we want to do is click this drop-down arrow in the top left here where it says Example Project. Click a plus button, and we're going to create a new project. And you can choose the region of your where your database is essentially going to be stored, and we can just change this name to Journal. Now, there probably are a lot of questions about this GraphCool service, right? It's a database, so well, what kind of database is it? And according to their documentation, it's SQL-based. And if you use your own hosted version of this, you can sort of use whatever kind of database you'd like. But one of the coolest things about GraphCool is you don't ever have to think about your database. I mean, you almost think about this as your database. So let's get into this interface a little bit in this introduction to GraphCool. So what we have here when we load it up is our schema page. And now here is going to be the schemas for all of our data. For instance, they give you a basic file and a basic user. Now this user one's certainly going to come in handy when we want to do our authentication. And over here on the right side, you're going to see a graphical, and when I say graphical, I just mean like using graphics, user interface version of your schemas here. So this is the actual GraphQL syntax version of your schema, and this is sort of just a CMS style version of your schema. Now I'm going to be going into quite a bit about some of the syntax and what everything means here, so don't worry if you aren't familiar with GraphQL. It has its own language, right? So this GraphQL schema language is its own thing, but it's highly reminiscent of JavaScript. The main differences are that, well, we have what could be considered JavaScript objects here, but there's no commas. So each line, you don't have a comma. We're also defining things as types. You could also define things as queries and mutations, a query being something where you pull from the database, a mutation being something where you modify something in the database. And what's cool about GraphCool is that we can come in here, and if you know GraphQL, you can just start typing, type post is at model. You can start typing this and write your schema this way. Or if you don't know GraphQL, GraphQL, you can do it via the interface and have it build it for you. And while you're doing that, get a total understanding of exactly the syntax and how things should look. So what other things are in GraphCool here? Well, we have a data page where you can add data in here, and we're going to be using this after we create our schema here in a second. And you could actually come in here and add a user, you could add a post or a file or anything in a graphic interface that, well, allows you to have this function a little bit more like a CMS. It's pretty cool. Now, next we have permissions. And this is going to be where you set your permissions for your different schemas and your data, right? Right now, everyone can read, create, update, and delete users, as well as everyone can read, create, and update these files. As we get in here, we're going to be tweaking these significantly, okay? Now, next, we have integrations, which you can see Algolia, which is like a hosted search API. You have an auth integration, auth0 integration, and we have email password auth, anonymous auth. So we're going to be using some of these too. You can see there's more to come. This is still a new service. Now, lastly, we have functions. And if you're wondering about functions, well, you can see that these are sort of server-side serverless functions that you are going to be using. We might not be getting into these too much in this series. Lastly, we have our playground, which, if you are familiar with GraphQL, is similar to a graphical sort of query builder, where we can test out our queries and see with a basic auto-completion, like what we want to search for. If we want to search for all of the users and then maybe give me their IDs, we can hit play and see this information. Now, obviously, this query is going to fail, and it's going to give you a nice little message saying, hey, none of the arguments were provided, aka we wanted a user, but we didn't give it an ID. If we were to do something like all users, which is brilliant that this auto-completes this for us, we do all users, and you can see we are returned with an empty array because there is no users. Okay, so with that basic introduction to GraphCool here, let's go ahead and get started writing our first model here. And we're going to be doing this through the GUI just so you can get a feel for the lay of the land here. If you know your GraphQL, you can certainly do it through the typing as well. I'm going to click add type here, and the new type is going to be a post, which we've already decided is the word we're using for this journal post. If you are using something else, that's great. You can add a description if you want, journal post. It doesn't really much matter. I've never used these descriptions for anything important. And we can just simply click save. Now we can click add field, and we want to have a new field, which is simply just going to be a title. Okay, this is going to be our journal title, like the individual post title. Now we're going to need to select what type of value it is. It's a string. It doesn't need to store multiple values, right? So it's not going to be an array. And, well, we don't necessarily need a description. If you want some advanced options, they're in here, whether or not this is a required or optional field. This field is going to be required. We can always tweak this stuff directly in the GraphQL schema itself. So just with that, we have a title. It's going to be a string, and hey, well, this button is now grayed out. Okay, this is going to be a common thing here if you have something wrong, and it's not always immediately obvious. But if you do attempt to click the button, whatever is the problem will be highlighted. I just want to make this obvious here. You do need your fields to be lowercase. Okay, so you can see now we have a green button, and it's all good. So we have a post ID and a post title. Now, this may seem ridiculous, but this is all we're going to leave it at for right now. Because what I want to do is I want to sort of get this information in here, and I want to be able to hit our API with it. I want to set up our Apollo on our actual application, and then we can see some data coming in before we get any more complex with it. So why complicate things any more than we need to other than having an ID and a title right now? So check it out. We now have our schema in here. We have the ability to start adding and querying on some data. I mentioned in the playground that we could have auto completion on our queries. And we're going to get to see a little bit of the power of GraphCool here. You'll remember the schema that we created was post. And if I just start to type P, you can see GraphQL is automatically created 2 queries for us. Now, in a typical GraphQL or Apollo setup, if you were controlling the server-side part, you would have to be creating all of your queries and stuff yourself, but GraphCool does this all for you, which is incredible. So now we can see that we can get an individual post that's going to be looking for an ID, or we can get all of our posts and we can look for the title, like this. Now, let me bump up the font size here. I wish this was an easier way to do this and the UI here. But the syntax that we're working with is open brackets, like I mentioned before, the word all posts, then brackets, and then the field that we want to grab. Now, if this is not familiar to you and you are not using GraphQL for anything else, this may seem super weird. And I apologize if I breezed over it for a second ago while I just type this in here, but we are going to be writing a lot more queries, and I will be going pretty in depth when it actually matters. Okay, so as you can see here, we're asking for all posts title, and it's saying, hey, here's your data, and here's all of your posts, which we have none. So what we're going to be doing in the next video is actually installing Apollo and getting it connected to GraphCool and getting our app up and running that way. Okay, and after that, we're going to add some database in here, and we're actually going to see some posts in our application. So before you know it, we're going to have some data coming in directly from our API into our native app, and sooner or later, we're going to be having the same thing going on where we can add our own posts. So as always, this is Scott with Level Up Tutorials, and if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the video below. If you'd like to complete this series, head on over to leveluptutorials.com, and where there are a ton of new series, a new series every single month. And what's going to be great is there's going to be a ton of GraphQL content, both within React Native, React, and all sorts of other ways. So if you are interested in GraphQL like I am, there's going to be a ton more GraphQL content on the Level Up Tutorial site this year. If you aren't interested in GraphQL, that's cool too, because if you become a Level Up Pro, you can actually vote on what up and coming series are going to be the next Pro Premium series. So as always, this is Scott. Thank you so much for watching, and I would really appreciate it if you would support Level Up Tutorials by becoming a Pro subscriber or purchasing some of the series I have available. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.